Shalom everyone, this is Yoel again for another episode of Tzol HaMikra. I'm really happy that you've joined me again, and I hope that the previous recordings have been beneficial for everyone who listens to them. Please tell your friends, your family, sharing is caring, and from what I know, people are more and more being exposed to these recordings. I've had several people contact me that they didn't know that I do these recordings, so if you're a listener, then make sure everyone else knows about this. As I said, sharing is caring, and commenting as well. I do want to ask people again, if there's anything you disagree with me or any comments you have, please leave them. I mean, I keep on hearing people, oh, they're so great and so on, and then every once in a while I get someone who says, I don't necessarily agree with everything that you say or your conclusions, and my response to that is, okay, let me know. I mean, the truth is that if you let me know, and if it's correct, then I'll correct myself, which is very important. In any case, you can't have a monologue. You have to sometimes have a dialogue. And don't be concerned about the fact that I'm very busy. Being very busy is just part of life. That's basically it. But in any case, I'm very glad that you're listening again, wherever you may be out there. And I have no control over what goes on with my throat. It is what it is. Some people have problems like this, like me. So I've tried a lot of tips that people gave me about clearing out my throat. Does not work. Just doesn't work. The moment I start recording, this happens. So this week, besides the Purim conundrum that I wrote about on Facebook, we have we have an interesting subject here of the first of all, when exactly Purim happens, and specifically with this week's recording, we also have a section that's usually read basically around the area of Purim as well. So we're going to actually rereading this in a couple of weeks, but I'm anyhow going to address it here because it's just very, very important to actually point out certain historical elements about this subject. I actually wrote an article called "The Origins of the Half Shekel." And now that I also have certification in early First Temple history, so I can actually now speak with actual, with someone else also saying I'm authoritative in it, but it's really irrelevant. Knowledge is really the point, not the piece of paper you have. But the point here is that the half shekel, really the way it's described in the Torah, is really nothing to do with what the Mishnah describes. Because let's just break it down. We're going to touch here on several subjects during this recording. I'm not going to cover anything that has to do with the temple. That's going to be incorporated in the Tumat Etzavev V'Akel Pkudei, which are all temple-oriented. So that's going to be like a mini temple series. If you go to my website, you'll see actually in recordings, you'll see on the category of the temple. And I might expand that when I have the time into other descriptions of the temple as well. I did spend several years working with a model of the third temple, so we might incorporate that as well. Though, when it comes to architecture, it's very difficult to reconstruct what he describes it because Ezekiel uses terminology that we don't necessarily understand. So anyone who tries to interpret it is really doing it by their own accord. But I am about to start reading some material about architecture. I've done archaeology, and I've done a lot of architecture issues in classes that I've taken, and I was thinking of just looking at some architecture of temples and structures in the ancient world to see if we can actually reconstruct something. But that's going to be in the future when I get to it. So first of all, it says Ki Tisa et Rosh Bnei Israel. Tisa comes from the root nasa, which is to raise up, which really means to account for. You either have kudim, which is, it says here, lifkudehem. Pakad is to account for, to count. And the idea, one of the interpretations of why do we specifically have here a description of accounting for people based on a half shekel, basically doing a census, which is really what the half shekel is, and not counting the actual people. It's not necessarily that clear. I mean, a lot of sources talk about what's known as Ain Hara, which is an evil eye, which is a very, very late concept. Ain Ra'a and Ain Tova are very, very late concepts. Ain Ra'a comes from the idea of witchcraft, of people putting the evil eye on someone or something. Ain Tova is not really sorcery. Ain Tova is just having goodwill, having a kindness towards others. But the point is that the Torah basically forbids counting the actual people. And we have an account in the book of Samuel towards the end of Sefer Shmuel where David accounts for the numbers of people. And especially, they're really just counting anyone over the age of 20 like we have here. And he does a census because he wants to know how many people are actually in his kingdom. And people start dying. And so we see that there's something wrong with actually counting people. And the census is really done by funneling the counting of the people through the temple being a protective element. So what we have here basically is any man over the age of 20 gives ish kofer nafsho, he gives the redemption of himself when they are counted. So the counting is the counting of people, but it is a counting of the actual money, and the money is a redemption to the individual. And the half shekel originally wasn't a temple tax. I mean, it is a temple tax, but it isn't. But we need to understand the position of the temple amongst Israel. The temple is the center of everything, not the king's court, the temple itself. The temple is the binding element that brings all of Israel together, not only 3 times a year, but it's the representation of all of Israel. Now, the idea is that the moment you fund something in the temple, you've basically, it's like almost like bringing a sacrifice. So that's probably the protective element here, that the counting of the people has been moved to the temple through the half shekel, and by doing that, the people are given a certain type of atonement, okay, that will prevent any negef. For example, we see in the story of the people who complain that Aharon runs between them and puts a burning incense and protects them. He stops the death. So the temple, though, is a place that if you walk into unclean, you might die or be afflicted in some way or another, or whatever the way specifically works. By putting in a sacrifice or something like that, or something in the temple, also works as a protective element. So the temple is the presence of God that can be very deadly, can also be very healing and very soothing and protective. And that's the thing. It's if you approach things correctly, you'll be protected. If you approach things incorrectly, you won't be protected. And that's the reality. That's the reality of the temple. And the people didn't fully understand this. This is why they turned around to Moses during Mount Sinai and said, "Don't let God speak to us, because we surely would die." And the reason that they said they'll surely die is because in the ancient world, people believe that if you're exposed to the actual deity himself, you die. And Moses is actually a person who is the opposite of that. He actually proves that you can be in the presence of God and survive. And we actually see this in this parasha. Excuse me. Then we actually have a weight here, and it says that the shekel is a 20 gerah. So half a shekel is a 10 gerah. Gerah, we don't necessarily know exactly what this weight is, but historically speaking, we have shekels, or also known as selah later on, which are anything between 9, the lowest I've ever heard was 9 grams of silver, all the way up to 14 grams. 14 grams being a very, very high quantity. And this, by the way, also connects to the whole redemption of the firstborn, because it gives us the weight itself, and really the weight for redeeming the firstborn, which for those who don't fully understand this, every firstborn male, not every child, every firstborn male is to be redeemed. I've had people send me emails about, "Oh, I have a daughter and she's a firstborn." No, there's no need to do that. It's only males, and basically the weight of 5 silver shekels is, if we take the middle ground, which is the majority, at least as far as I know, the majority of coins which were found, it's about 11 grams. So really, if you send about, so if you give a coin something like 2 ounces of silver, you're perfectly fine. So if you give two troy ounces, you've done it. Some people hold to a symbolic idea of giving specifically 5 coins, but that's a very, very late way of looking at things, because really, in truth, 5 shekels is a weight and could be done with almost anything. Prior to the existence of coins, they would use anything they had. which meant you can pull off, if you had a jewelry that was made out of silver that you can give, that's what you did. And there are even stories. The Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu Landi, when he wanted to redeem, his parents did the firstborn redemption, but he had certain ideas about how things were supposed to be done. So, for example, he gave the equivalent of 5 silver shekels to a Kohen that he knew. He was trying to cover himself from all angles. That's basically what he was doing. But in any case, we have that, and the money is v'lakachta et kesef haKippurim. This is an atonement money, and basically you give it al avodat oel moed. You give it to the work of the temple. So this is a very interesting thing about the Israelite temple. I will bring up something small about the temple here. The Israelite temple is a temple that is not funded by grounds or property and things like that. Really, the temple exists in its own sphere, and this is why also people who are temple servants, like Levites and priests, don't really own land, because the temple, besides existing in another sphere, the temple is not here to take away from people's property. What's interesting is, what do you do with Ezekiel? Because Ezekiel does give a description of temple servants who do have property around Jerusalem. That's a very interesting subject. There are a lot of questions about the book of Yechezkel, and some things we just don't necessarily know how to answer. This is one of the reasons why in the Tractate of Shabbat they speak about that there was a want to remove Yechezkel from canon because of some contradictions that exist in it and what the Torah says. And in truth, I don't really know the answer here unless we start saying temple servants are more. The temple servants there are not Levites or priests. These are people who are brought to Jerusalem as so for example, private contractors or something like that guard the temple, that work in the temple to renovations and stuff like that. And it might be just a way of, I'm going to take you away from your tribe that has this specific property, and I need you near the temple, so I'm going to compensate you by giving you property here. Okay, so we're not necessarily looking at a massive change. We're looking more at a change that's necessary for administrative issues, and not actual changes of giving Levites or priests land. It's more of an issue of keeping certain workers in the vicinity of the temple and just protecting them, which was very common in the ancient world, where if you had a central place like a king's court or something, the king could bring in certain individuals to live around nearby, and he would give them land grants and stuff like that, which enabled them to live and do their work. The half shekel, as it's practiced in as it is described in the Mishnah, and basically actually described in other external sources of the Mishnah, so we know the half shekel was actually given as an actual gift to the temple. It wasn't something just in theory. The Mishnah, when it comes to the temple, I personally believe has a lot of things it describes theoretically, and really there's no actual evidence that that's exactly how they did things. People who base descriptions of temple service solely on the Mishnah have a technical problem that the Mishnah was composed much, much later with probably a lot of Pharisaic ideology, and doesn't necessarily really give us a full description of what was done, because though it tries to describe that the Pharisees controlled everything, the temple was still the priestly domain, and a lot of the Kohanim were not Pharisees. They would have been just regular people or Sadducees. So I have a lot of questions about the practices, though there are descriptions, like for example, Yochanan Holkenos, who was one of the Hasmonean kings, or it wasn't referred to as a king, but technically a king. He had undone some Pharisaic practices in the temple, so we do know that there were Pharisaic practices incorporated in the temple itself, but we don't necessarily know if the entire temple was run under Pharisaic interpretation, which means the Mishnah might be describing something more of the ideal of the Pharisaic world and less the actual practicality of how things were done. But the description of the half shekel, probably the practice of half shekel is a temple tax, because that's really how the temple took care of itself. It didn't have any land, unlike a lot of temples in the ancient world. It had no land, and it really worked off of donations. And people wanted to donate. Even people who were not Jewish, were not Israelites, donated to the temple. We have descriptions of kings bringing gifts to the temple. Ptolemies II, if I'm not mistaken, was described as giving massive gifts to the temple of Jerusalem. Antiochus III, known as Antiochus the Great, gave a lot of, not necessarily gifts, but a lot of privileges to the temple of Jerusalem to help it and make it work. So we know as a fact the temple was really funded by people giving donations. And that's the thing, there was no enforcement. You didn't have to give to the temple. People just gave because they knew it was the right thing to do. So when people turn around and says, you must give, no, there's no such commandment. The only commandment you have that you must give are the sacrifices you have to bring every at the necessary times, and the truma. Sorry, it's very strange. When I start recording, this happens. When I'm just everyday life, it doesn't happen. I have no idea what the point, why it happens. But the truma, which is given to the kohanim, and the maaser, which is given to the leviim, which is really not really temple based. It's just the fact that Levites just don't have land, and the only thing they do is really do temple service and work, and teach. But the temple itself wasn't funded by anything, and during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, the temple was the population of Judea was so weak, and the temple was so weak that they had to enforce a tax to at least make the temple work. And what this actually created is a reality that there's basically this decree, this human decree to fund the temple, and the decree just kept on because people were willing to do this. I mean, people wanted to give. But the Torah itself describes this as something that you do when you do a census, and not when you just every year. And every year is basically a tax. This was not a temple tax in that sense. So the origins of it is really from times of Ezra and Nehemiah, where it describes to give the third of the shekel. Now people say it's a third of the shekel, no half a shekel. Yes. The third of the shekel is based on the size of the drachma, of the coin that they were using at the time, which was bigger than the ancient weight. What they did was they standardized, certain places they started standardizing weights and producing coins. Prior to that, there were no coins. People just gave pieces of silver and they weighed them. The standardization of weight through coins came much, much later. And when they standardized the size of what they call, what can be compared to a shekel, which is the large coin, they understood that this is too heavy. So they said a third of a shekel, which would be the biblical weight of a half shekel. And that's the explanation of that. Then we have a description here of Shabbat. And it really, I'm not going to go into this discussion here of, again, what is melacha and things like that. People who have been following me know that there's a big dilemma here, how to even interpret this concept of work on Shabbat and so on. But first of all, verses 16, 17 are used in liturgy, in Jewish liturgy, especially during the day. So basically before Kiddush, we say verses which are taken from Genesis 2, and then we hear in the morning when we do what's known as Kiddush Rabbah, the big Kiddush, which originally was just saying the blessing over a cup of wine, which is who created the fruit of the wine. And but in time, people started incorporating a lot of things because they weren't too sure exactly what to do, because they knew it was called Rabbah. So they started adding verses. So the most simplest, most basic practice was to read verses 16, 17 of chapter 31 in Exodus, which is V'shamru v'nei Yisrael Shabbat, לעשות השבת דאותם ברית עולם, ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם, כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ויום השביעי שבת וינפש. And these verses actually really incorporate both elements of Shabbat. The Shabbat of Genesis, because it says, כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. And it also speaks about it being an ot, a sign of the covenant. So it kind of takes both elements and puts them together. I would say that in the evening we read the verses from Genesis because it really has to do with the evening coming in and the creation being completed. So it's like we're like reaccounting the last moments of the 6 days of creation. Or here we're already in Shabbat, so we remember backwards about creation. This day being the symbol of the end of creation, but also incorporating the concept of the Shabbat being a sign between Israel and God. Now, a lot of people ask this question. It says here, "Ushmartem et Shabbat," you will keep this out. This is verse 14. "Ki kodesh hilachem," for it is holy to you. And the concept of holiness is a complex concept, but I actually have a small recording about holiness, and I will put it up after edit it and then put it up because it's part of a larger class that I gave. And it says, "Mechalalei mot yumat." Anyone who desecrates it will be surely put to death. And the question a lot of people ask is about capital punishment. I've seen people speak about this as well, and seen rabbis answer people's questions about this. And I remember when I was in high school, we asked the same question because in our world today, capital punishment is frowned upon. And especially capital punishment when it's not done against other human beings. So we need to understand in a society of covenant, when someone betrays the covenant, betrays what's agreed upon as the thing that brings us together as a society, this person becomes a danger to society. Traitors are usually either imprisoned for their entire lives or they're executed. Treachery is an act which everyone, I do not know of a human being that does not get angry over treachery. No idea. The point to make here is as follows: that there was a change in mankind during the 18th century. And during the 18th century, it's very bad today, no idea why. During the 18th century, there was a man called Friedrich the Great, or Friedrich II. And he himself went through trauma because a very good friend of his was executed. He had a friend he wasn't supposed to be friends with, and his friend was executed by his father. His father Friedrich the Great, was a very, very violent man. Was very hard toward his own son. And that developed certain things in his personality. He was a very rough man as well, but he created an ideal to get rid of executions and torture. And the problem that he had was that he knew that certain things he can't just pass, you can just kind of ignore. So he, with the ideal of, he started promoting in the world this ideal of preventing executions. Just preventing executions, period. And this started developing as a movement in the world, so they were trying to stop executions, and that's more or less where we start hearing about the anti-execution movement. But he himself understood something very simple. He said there's a certain practicality you have to keep here. So certain people are so dangerous to their own people that you just can't keep them. So he himself, we know that he signed execution orders to different people, though he was preaching against it. But in time, people started talking about the idea that executions are a useless mechanism. It's better to reform people, to take them into correctional facilities and change them. Now, though I think that's very, very true, the problem is that we need to remember that there's a certain concept of honor and a certain concept of shame in the world as well. And we need to understand that there are certain acts that you're not supposed to forgive. Treachery is one of them. Because if you start forgiving treachery, what it does is it weakens the ideals of society. It literally weakens the ideals of society. And a society without ideals is a society that will break down. You have to have something that manages people. I mean, as much as people don't like being told what to do, there is a need for society to have laws and regulations. A society without laws and regulations is a society that will fall apart. It will fall apart. And this is something that people who are historians, for example, point this out. For example, Edward Gibbon wrote a massive book about the demise of Rome. And what he actually points out there, besides him blaming Christianity for almost anything on earth, the point he was trying to make in his book was that Rome really died out when ideals, when rules and regulations were overstepped and people started doing whatever they wanted. People started promoting the ideology of having whatever you want with no calculation, doing whatever you want. And he basically says all the Roman colonies became fat and just useless and unproductive, and the ideals of what made the Roman Republic so great died out. Now we have our beef with the Roman Republic in general. They ruined Judea. They destroyed us. We see them as enemies. But the point is that he makes a very, very good point about it. That there are certain things that you just can't say, oh, whatever, it's okay, it'll be fine. You just can't do that. So the answer is, the idea that the Bible is this executing book that's out there just to kill people left, right, and center is very, very wrong. Someone actually came out lately with this claim that the Bible is the most violent book, the most violent religious book. But the Bible is it's not a religious book. Okay, it's also an account of history of the people, and actually criticizes the violence. There's a specific point when it brings out the violence. It describes it in a very, very bad way, except for certain situations such as war between groups. But it's like me taking any history book and saying, oh, these books are so violent, because that's the history of mankind, violence. It's the history of mankind. It's violence. It's upset a lot of people. So yes, on the one hand, we try to move away from violence, so it's more comfortable for us to say capital punishment will be done with. It won't exist anymore. But then on the other hand, if we think about who we are as human beings, there are things that if you overstep them, anyone will be offended. Each person has his own realm of ideals. For example, if I walk into someone's house and I tell them to the face something very, very rude, they won't necessarily try to stab me, but they'll kick me out of the house and never speak with me again. Okay, so each person has his lines. So there are the point here being is that there are certain lines the Torah ascribes, which I think even our societies have concepts like this as well. That if someone breaks the Sabbath or does certain things which disrupt the structure of society, that person has to be executed. Okay, we do this to this very day. So why do people start talking about the Torah? Is because it's a religious book, and we have this kumbaya ideal that's been hovering around since the 60s. But in truth, yes, capital punishment will return, okay, if necessary. And how exactly it would work and everything. I'm not a judge. I've never been a judge. I don't think it's easy to be a judge has to condemn someone to death. The Talmud talks about how difficult these things are and what happens with the people who have to condemn people to death. They have to behave like mourners. It's not an idea. There's no ideal of killing people. The ideal is to actually save people as much as possible. But there are certain concepts which are so fundamental for the existence of society. And when you have a mass murderer, people want that person dead. When you have a rapist, or you have when you have a situation of a child molester, child molesters are murdered in prisons, because even some of the worst people on earth understand there's certain things you don't do. Okay, so you just have to start thinking about that. I'm not here to pass judgment. I'm not here the one to say yes or no. I'm not in charge. I'm just saying, people ask this question and I say yes, and specifically because Shabbat is a sign. It is a fundamental concept. It's the constitution of the Torah. And anyone who rebels against the Constitution is really rebelling against the things which bind the covenant people of the Torah. And, it's not our job as individuals to condemn people and execute them. It's a job of a community, and it has to be a decision made by the community and by the community leaders. But at the end of the day, if this is what the Torah says, and this is what it's going to be, if you don't accept that, then you have to start asking questions about, do you really believe in the Torah, or do you just pick and choose what you want? Okay, I know it's a little harsh, but it's just the reality. People like talking about the beauty of the Torah, and I point this out all the time. People talk about the beauty of the Torah, and they forget that there are certain things that have to be inside sometimes, which are just not that beautiful. Okay, and today, especially in the environment we live today, with people who are people are exposed to what goes on in Muslim countries of execution, and how the media and how the Western world outcries against these things, and it really, if you remember that this is changing our perception of reality. It's changing we're trying to read now Torah through the eyes of the Western world, which is wrong. The Torah is belongs to the ancient world. It's not part of the ideals of the Western world. Yes, I agree. There are situations in Iran and Saudi Arabia where they execute women for looking at a man. That's ridiculous. Okay, there's a certain logic that has to work here. Islam in general has a tendency to treat women in a very, very bad manner, but I know this is a very sensitive subject to a lot of people because we live in a very different world. But the fact remains the Torah does give capital punishment in certain situations. And really, in many of the situations, these are things that either disrupt the covenant society just as a society, or that it is a rebellion against God, which is the foundation of everything. So I know this might be a little difficult for people to listen to. Maybe some people would disagree with me, but the fact remains the Torah says that. It's just a reality. We can't paint everything in pink. Some things cannot be painted with pink. In any case, now we have Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. Or actually before he comes down from Mount Sinai, they make the golden calf. People have spoken about the golden calf over and over and over again. One of the concepts that I suggested in a recording I did about 2 years ago was that they weren't worshiping the calf as a calf. They actually worshipped the calf as God. And what they broke wasn't the first commandment. What they broke was actually the second commandment. The calf wasn't here to replace God. The calf was really here to replace the representation of God on earth. And at the time, the representation of God on earth was Moses. So one of the things I suggested in this recording was that really they say, Ele Elohecha Yisrael asher elucha. Let me see what the verse is. Ele Elohecha Yisrael asher elucha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I had the verse right. And this is the God. This is your God Israel, which brought you out of Egypt. And you have to remember that the difficulty that people were having with was the fact that Moses hasn't showed up yet. Not that God has abandoned them or anything. They needed some kind of representation. Now, this might give you some insight to how the Israelites at this point perceived Moses. Moses was probably like Pharaoh to them, and the pharaohs were the living God. One of the concepts in Egypt was that the pharaohs were the living God. They were the physical manifestation of Horus. At each stage in their life, there were different representation, but the king himself was a representative of the gods on earth. By Moses vanishing, they perceived that their representation of God was gone, and therefore they need a new representation. They couldn't pick one of them because there was no one they can ordain as one. So they took the next best thing that had in Egypt was the image of the god. Now, picking a bull, a lot of people try to connect this bull to it wasn't really a bull, it's a calf, first of all. But a lot of people try to equate this calf with the god El, who's also described as a bull. But there's a difference. This is not a bull, this is a calf. So some people want to argue, there's a certain mockery here of the pagan practice of the god El, and therefore it describes it as being a calf, but it actually might have actually been a bull, and the text makes fun of it. But what's interesting is this concept of having a calf actually it probably was a calf, because we know that there were calves, a bronze calf found in Samaria. And what the concept here of the calf is that they didn't want to make an image of a human being, because they knew that would be completely wrong. So they were trying to play around inside the possibilities, and there was another representation of something divine on earth was a bull, which was the Epso bull of Egypt. So it's possible they went for a calf or a bull to represent the other manifestation of a god on earth, but they didn't want to make a human being because they knew a human being would be crossing a certain line. So it's interesting. They were. One may argue, based on what I'm seeing here, one may argue that they were trying to find ways inside Torah to play around with some of the parameters of what the Torah allows and forbids, through and trying to avoid, okay, let's not do the worst, but we can do something else, which kind of reminds me of things sometimes in certain interpretations I hear, especially by people from the Reformed movement, that they say, yeah, but then they start playing with some parameters of halacha. They say, yeah, but here's a little thing that we might, there's pikuach nefesh, so they're saving someone's life, so we're gonna manipulate that to claim that this is a situation of pikuach nefesh. Like for someone I knew who got on a plane, we don't usually travel like that during Shabbat. Someone got on a plane during Shabbat and flew because they decided there was some level of pikuach nefesh, because there was someone that was feeling unwell, because there was a whole mishmash of stuff there. And I looked at them and I said, are you kidding me? I mean, seriously, are you kidding me? It doesn't work like that. Okay, if you say you work in the parameters of halacha, you have to work in those parameters. You can't just take some kind of a rule and play with it. And this is probably the thing about the Israelites. They weren't rebelling against God in the sense of saying, we are going to replace God with this golden calf. They actually wanted to have a representation of God by a golden calf, and they specifically made a calf because they knew making a human being would be wrong. Also because they never actually saw God, they don't really know what he looks like. And they didn't want to make a statue of Moses because as far as they know, Moses is gone, and they knew that Moses wasn't God. So they tried to take something else that could be a representation. So it's difficult a bit to go into the psyche of exactly what they were thinking because we're not there. The one thing is very clear from this verse is that they weren't trying to replace God. They were just trying to find a representation of him on earth. And they couldn't make a statue of a human being or Moses. The other thing as well is it says, V'yakumu letzachek at the end of verse 6. V'yakumu letzachek is to behave in a foul way. This is why people try to always think about what went on, for example, in the description of the in the movie Ten Commandments. So there's something, a lot of dancing is something very sexual, and letzachek, some people do understand it as being a sexual act, but we don't necessarily have to say that there was something sexual here. We can also say that letzachek is just to behave like fools or to do something which is forbidden. Letzachek is to do, for example, I'm just kidding. When someone does something offensive or ridiculous towards someone else, and they say, "Oh, I'm just kidding. There's a certain behavior. We can say that tzachek is really behavior of behaving without thinking, doing things which are childish or acting in a way that's not respectable. People who go and pull pranks on one another and stuff like that. That's kind of the concept of tzachek, to do things which normally socially people don't do because it harms other people, it's offensive, and this could be just behavior that will offend most religious people, and it does not necessarily have to be sexual. Then what happens is that Moshe goes down, and you can just read through the chapter. I really don't want to focus too much on the subject here of what happened, because I've done this several times, and plenty of people have spoken about this. And there's some people, for example, talk about the whole thing of Moses grinding the calf into powder and then forcing people to drink it as being a type of sotah, that he was testing them like the sotah, that those who did worship will become bloated. Again, these are midrashic ideas that we cannot necessarily prove. One of the interesting things that happens here is what happens in chapter 34. Moses towards the end of chapter 33 says, you told me, he says to him, you told me that that you prefer me, but you didn't tell me who you're going to send with me. And if I do find favor in your eyes, let me know who you are, and so I'd be able to, so I can be able to govern your people. And Moses basically is turning around to God and says, I want to know who you are. I want to understand you. Because Moses has only been really in contact with God for maybe a year. And during that year, he was mostly doing miracles. He was mostly the voice of God. But now he has to become a leader, because God turns around to him and says, Ki chata amecha. He basically turns around and says, your people have sinned. Okay? He says to him Shechet. He says, verse 7, for chapter 32, verse 7, it says, Ki shechet amecha asher ha'eleta me'eretz Mitzrayim. He turns around and says, it's your people. They're your responsibility. And after this entire ordeal, Moses turns around, and now that he's dealt with it, with the way he had to deal with it, he sits there and he says, well, if this is my people and I'm supposed to lead them, but you're our God, I need to know who you are so I know how I'm supposed to act. And the thing is that knowing God is not just knowing a name, but also knowing who he is, seeing who he is, understanding how he behaves. But we can find, for example, in ancient literature, especially from Egypt, that if you see your God, you die, and only the dead can actually see the divine, because they're already dead. Only spirits can see the divine. But Moses might be working off of a working assumption here that a king, if this is his people, he is the king. And if he is the king, then a king, when he is crowned, sometimes is given the privilege of seeing the divine realm. And one of the descriptions we have about certain pharaohs is that they would see the divine presence when they're crowned. And God says to him, no, you can't see that. You can't see who I am, because it just doesn't work. There's no possibility. But what I'll do is I'll give you my attributes. And what he does here is in chapter 34, he gives him a series of attributes that anyone can read. The translations in English more or less give a good account of it. But what's interesting here, it doesn't describe God being wise or powerful or anything like that. Really, in truth, the description that we have here is very, very different. So I made a comment a couple of days ago that there's a large difference between the God of Israel and the gods of the ancient world, because there are literary literature. The word I'm looking for is from the word literature. There are literary tools which are used in the ancient world that sometimes cause this understanding that the God of Israel and the gods of the ancient world were the same. And the answer is, these are just mechanisms. These are tools. These are literary tools which were used, which were conventional. People there were basically schematic structures of how to describe something, how to write something, and so on. And people were just using them. These were just basically paradigms of how you write something. But when they actually start speaking about God, it's very different. So the first massive difference we have is in God's name. The name, the tetragrammaton of Yud He Vav He, is very different than the description of names of other gods. A lot of the gods basically had a combination of a name that took an element in nature, added something that represented ownership or power, and that was the deity. The deity was strongly connected to a nature element, and that was who they were. Okay, and there are loads and loads of examples of names. And usually things like master of some sort, and so for example, the form in represented power, an or in represented power, and then you have a god like Enlil, En being master, and Lil being air, so the master of air. So Enlil was the god that was credited to storms and air and the movement of air, but his name was really a combination of master and air and things like that. Enki, for example, master of Ki, which means master of the land. Okay, Ki, because Ki means, for example, in Sumerian means land. So Enki meant god of the land or master of the land. On the other hand, the god of Israel is referred to as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, which basically means he who exists. He is not connected to anything as nature. Actually, he is entirely disconnected from everything that surrounds him. Nature, he is not part of nature. He created nature. This is why the book of Genesis it describes what it describes as God creating everything, but the creation doesn't come from his body or from anything from him. Not from any lights that come out of him, not from any manifestation of himself. He just commands creation to come into existence, and it exists. And this is how God is described in the Bible, which is consistent throughout the entire Bible. The only thing is, like, for example, does God have a form, which is something we can talk about here for a second. So this is, first of all, just by the name itself, because names in the ancient world defined things in great detail. They define things. So if you have a name, it really defines who you are. And the God of Israel is described as just he who exists, and that's it. There are other attributes, creator of heaven and earth. He is an El, which means one who is like a bull, who is powerful. He is an Adon, who means he's a Lord, and so on. But his actual name is very, very different than what you find in the ancient world. His name just says he exists. What defines him? Existence. And we know we can learn who he is through his actions, which are the attributes we have here. Then gods in the ancient world were also described as immortal. They had personalities, which is something we rarely see about the God of Israel. They were sometimes very human. Their behavior was very human. The God of Israel, there are places where it sounds as if he's human, like, for example, he regrets and he's sad and he's angry, but there's a lot of debate of these really things that he felt, or is this just for our ears so we kind of get an understanding? They are considered, gods in the ancient world considered to be masters. We actually hear this about the God of Israel as well, but they talk about eternal life, but also dying as well. God of Israel is never described in that way. He just exists. The concept of life to him, for something to be alive, it means it also has to be born. That's how some scholars understand this. So they're born, they're alive, and they can also die. They just have very, very long lives, but they can be killed. Kind of slightly reminds you of something that Anthony Hopkins says in one of the movies. He plays Odin in the Thor movies, and he says a very profound sentence. He says, "We are not gods. We are born, we live, and we die." Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And I remember hearing that line. I'm like, that's a very good explanation of what pagan gods were like. They exist in a cycle. They are part of nature. They represent nature's cycle. And the God of Israel is disconnected from that. He just exists. He exists. There's no birth. There's no death. There's no living. It's just existence. A lot of gods are described as being powerful, and so on. But we don't hear this about the God of Israel. Then we have, for example, the glow of the gods, also known as the Melamu. It's referred to as Melamu, which means a shining, a glowing. But the only character we hear ever of a glow are angels or Moses. God is never described as a glowing entity, but there could have been some kind of a glow that represents the presence of God. But again, God is referred to more as a consuming fire, as something that nature will have a great difficulty to even stand next to. That nature, God is not part of nature, and therefore nature cannot contain God. So God, the moment he ascends to earth, descends to earth, nature can't contain his presence. This is why there's some people actually make the argument that it wasn't really God himself that came on Mount Sinai, only just the tip of his feet or something, just so he doesn't destroy earth. Again, it's a possibility, but for example, Moses glowing, for example, some people talk about radiation, aliens, but really the glow itself actually fits in what we know in the ancient world, which is when you were in the presence of a deity, and if you were touched by a deity, or you entered the divine realm, which is probably what happened with Moses. He wasn't sitting there for 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain. He went into the divine realm, and he perceived the divine realm from in the first account, and he was in the presence of the divine. This is why he glowed. So horns, karan, kikaron al pnei Moshe, actually drawing actual horns was acceptable in the ancient world. But it was really more symbolic. They were looking at horns and they were thinking of glow. It wasn't literally horns, but representing horns as something divine was actually quite common in the ancient world. But the other thing here also to point out is God is really described only through his actions. We don't really have an understanding of who God is. God was really was comprehended through his actions. The history of God is his interaction with mankind. He's not as if he's in a struggle with other deities or anything like that. Here's the early history. There's no such thing. Existence came to be, and existence just has to recognize the fact that he just exists. And God is described through his kindness towards humanity, but also his need to rule. Not his need, but the need to rule. So sometimes also punish human beings. And Moses recognizes this, but one of the things that come out is that God it describes that it says here in chapter 33, verse 22, and when I pass, when my kavod, when my glory or presence passes, I will place you in a cave in the rock, and I'll place my hand upon it. So some people play off of this saying, you'll see, and you only see my back and you won't see my face. So some people take this to say that God actually has a physical form. And this has been, the concept of God having a physical form is a big debate that went on in medieval times. And there were people who believed God actually had a physical form. And a lot of the gods are described as being very, very large human beings. And so some people say this, but then you have to start thinking about maybe symbolism here. The hand being a protective element. He's not saying I'll literally put my hand, but I will protect you from my presence so it doesn't flood the cave you're in and kill you. And seeing my back is only comprehending me through my actions. How do I know someone exists? Because I can see their action. How do I know there's an architect or construction workers that build a building? I can see their actions, but I don't see the architect himself. I don't see the construction workers. So he's telling him, you will only comprehend me through my actions on earth, but you'll never comprehend me through my actual existence, because no one can do that. You can see someone from the back and you say, oh, that's a human being. And he might be this person, but when you go and see their face, then you recognize who they are. So one should and probably, could and probably should argue that there's more symbolic language here than anything else. And Moses is exposed only to part of this, and he immediately bows down because he's exposed not only to the presence of God, but also to knowledge. And that humbled him because he suddenly you can imagine maybe having a whoosh of knowledge go through you and realizing something, comprehending something, and then understanding. And this is what God was trying to avoid this with Moses, because he said, if you really have any comprehension of who I am or what I am, you won't survive. You just won't survive. And Moses suddenly realized this, and this is why he bows down. He basically, by bowing down also means he covers his face. God redoes the covenant here. He goes over the basic principles of the covenant. So he mentions the feasts and being basically temple issues. We also have a mentioning of not boiling in its mother's milk. Context again is Reshit B'korei Admatcha Tavi Beit Adonai Elohecha, the first fruits of your land you will bring to the house of the Lord your God, and you won't cook his mother's milk. Here, because it's a summary, one may argue it's just brought there as just an extra thing, but why focus specifically on that? So I think there's again an issue here of no fertility practices in my temple. I am not a pagan god. I am not this male figure that waters the earth. You can understand the metaphors I'm using here. Waters the earth and life sprouts out of me and so on. No fertility practices, because I am not that God. I exist. Creation didn't come from me. I am not watering the earth. I am not, I'm not a manifestation of your earth. You don't need to do any fertility practices. And then we have the famous verses that talk about the face of Moses glowing, and he takes new tablets, and there's a big question, what is the difference between the first tablets and the second tablets? And really the truth is, one may argue the first tablets were a completely divine design. God chiseled out the stone and wrote on them, and here already Moses had to chisel out the stones, but God still wrote on them. It's called Ktav Elohim, which no one really understands what the writing of God actually means, divine writing. It's not clear at all. Unless you want to argue divine means connected to the glowing of the Melemus, and maybe the letters glowed. No way of actually knowing. Michtav Elohim. We're left with that. It's a Michtav Elohim, and that's it. And Moses has to cover his face. Moses has to cover his face because people were still very afraid of the divine presence. It's a scary thing. When you see something powerful and majestic, it's scary. And that's probably what people were feeling. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. I know the discussion about capital punishment might have been a little uncomfortable for some people, but I had to say at least a few words about it. I am very pro-life. If there's a way of preventing someone from being executed, this is a rabbinic trait as well. There's something I grew up with, which is trying to save life as much as possible. But again, unfortunately, when someone's rebellious and someone betrays his own people, unfortunately, some of the things cannot be forgiven. In any case, hope you enjoyed this. If there are any questions, any comments, again, please feel free to make them. I'm interested to hear your opinions. And if you listen to this before Shabbat, may have a wonderful Shabbat. If it's during Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. If it's after Shabbat, I hope you enjoyed your Shabbat. Kol Tov.